All right, our next video in the Service Worker series is going to be talking about the Cache API. Now, I'm not going to actually do anything with the Service Worker in this video. We're just going to look at the Cache API. We can actually use the Cache API from the web page. It doesn't have to be used in a Service Worker. Now, you're going to be using it in the Service Worker. In the next video, I'm going to show how to integrate the two things. But I find it's much easier if you separate the two concepts and we just talk about the cache. So we're going to do that. This is a list of all the methods that we're going to look at. So there's two main objects. There's a caches object, which is this keyword right here, caches. That is actually a keyword in JavaScript. It has these methods for opening up the cache. You can look for requests inside of the cache. You can get a list of everything in the cache, or a list of all the caches that you have created. You can find out if a cache exists in the list of caches, and you can delete a specific cache. Once you've opened a cache, if you use the open method, you get back a cache object, and that's what all these are. So once you have a single cache, you can add things to it. You can add a list of things, an array of things. You can delete something in it. You can get a list of all the things in that one cache. You can look for a match or all the matches for something inside of a cache. And you can put something into it. Now, add and put sound like they're the same thing. The difference between the two of them is that if you call add or add all, it's the same thing as if you did a fetch and then a put. Put means you've handled the fetching or the creating of the file all on your own, and all you want to do is say, okay, here, I've got a file object, and I'm going to put it into the cache. All right, so let's jump into the code. This is my sample page. If you look down at the description, you'll see that there is a link to the code gist for all these files, and there's also a link to the cache reference on the MDN website. Now, in my website that I've built here, I've got one CSS file, one JavaScript file, an HTML, and a service worker. The service worker file, it's in here, but I'm not actually doing anything with it. In my main JavaScript file, the section where I would register and use the service worker, it's completely commented out. I'm not doing that. Here, if I refresh my page, you can see in the application service worker section of the DevTools, I don't have any service workers running. So I'm going to do all this from the main script itself. Down here under cache, the application cache, I mentioned this in the previous video, doesn't exist anymore. This is something that was sort of a temporary thing before service workers were developed. The cache storage, that's what we're doing here. This is the Cache API. Lets us work with this. We can create caches the same way you'd create a local storage key or you'd create an IndexedDB database. We can create caches, and then inside those caches, we can save files. It's like having an array of files. Those files are actually response objects, and the keys for each one of them is the request. So the request, it could be the request object, it could be the URL, it could be just the string that represents the URL. Any of those three things we can use here. When we're calling the add methods, we can say, okay, here's the string, or here's a URL object, or here's a request object, and then we give it the response and say, that's what's going to be paired up with this in this list of files. All right, so let's put some files in there. Jump back into the browser. I have a couple of images here, and these are going to be the files that I save in the cache. Right now, they're not being used on the web page at all. If we jump over here, there's no images in the page. We're going to be adding them to the cache programmatically. All right, so I have inside my init function, all the service worker stuff is commented out. I've got a function called start caching, and I'm going to call that right away. I'm going to be creating the function called delete cache a little bit later. So when I click on the H2, I'm going to be able to delete things. We're going to look at deleting a single item or an entire cache. All right, so we need to, first of all, open a cache before you can delete or add or put or search or get the keys or anything like that. We need to open the cache. So caches, that's the built-in object. We're going to call the open method. Then you have to provide a name. Well, I happen to create a variable up here, cache name. This is what I called it. I can call it anything I want, but that's what is going to go inside of here, app.cacheName. Now, the open method looks to see if it's there. If it does, it hands me back a reference. If it doesn't, it will create it and hand me back the reference. It uses promises, so we will have a then method, and this is going to be my cache object. So if we get to this point, it means we have opened a cache. All right, so I will save that, and we'll come in here, and the page automatically reloaded because I've got the live server running. But you'll see there's a little arrow, and there it is. There's my asset cache. It is now open. And there will be like an array that we create inside of here. There's an index number. There's a name. This is the URL. And then we have response type. So what kind of file, and the rest of the stuff is all about the response object that we put in there. So let's add some files. We have the cache opened. Didn't look at the console. There it is. So it is opened. It was created in here. Now I want to actually put some files. So let's say let URL string equal, and we're just going to try the string method first of all. In my image folder, I've got these two files, and when you save files or response objects in the cache, what you are saving is as the key, as the name. Sure, it's this, but really it's the request object. It's everything that makes up this URL. There is the domain, there is the file name, there is also the query string. So if I had this, that is going to make this into a unique thing that I'm saving inside there. So if I say cache.add and I save URL string, remember, add equals fetch plus put. So we don't have the object itself, and we're not allowed to do a fetch of a file in a local folder. But by doing it this way, by starting it with the slash, what I'm saying is use the same domain, this 127.0.0.1:5500, that domain, look there for this image. So I'll save that. And as soon as I did, there is the file. So it actually went and fetched this file. That's what it is. The name, we can see, includes the domain, the port, the protocol, the path and file name, and the query string. All of those different parts are part of what makes this resource this resource. Now, we did this one with the URL string. We could also create a URL object. It's going to do the same thing. So if I did that, I'm going to take this string, put it in here with a slightly different query string. This becomes a brand new resource. It's like it's an entirely new file. I'm creating another entry inside of here. When I save it, what did I fail to construct URL? Oh, yes, of course. I need to put on the protocol and everything. I need the entire thing. Just like in here, when we looked at this, it included the entire part, the HTTP 127.0.0.1. We have to add that in here as well. If it's going to be a URL, it has to be a full valid URL. There we go. Save that. There. Now we have two of them. So 1, 2. It's the same file, but we now have two copies of that saved inside of here, inside of our cache. We can create a request object like this. When you create a request object, you can do the same sort of thing. It's like making a fetch call. So this URL, the request can accept either a URL or a URL string. Either one is valid. And let's give this a different one. Number 3, cache.add rec. And this is really just to show you that you can't have multiple copies of the same file. And there's 3 different types of things you can pass in here. So you can pass in a request object, you can pass a URL object, or you can pass in just the URL string. The browser is going to be able to figure out what it wants, or what the object is, and save it inside of here because, remember, add is like saying do a fetch and then a put. So it's doing a fetch for each of these, bringing them back, and putting them into our cache. Okay, now, if you want to see what you have inside of here, if you want to see the contents of your cache, we can do that too. We just have to call cache, and that is the single cache that we're looking at right now, .keys. This is also a method that's going to return a promise, so we can chain a then onto the end, and it will give us back an array called keys. So after we have that, we'll just do a loop. So keys.forEach, and we will get a key and an index for each one of these. There we are. Save that. And there we are in the console, 0, 1, 2. Those are the first 3 things. And we can see ID1, ID2, ID3. Those are the 3 items that we put into our cache. And each one of these things is a request object. So it didn't matter that we used a string or a URL or a request. Once we called add, what we were doing was putting into the cache a request object and a response object. So each one of the things in the cache has a request object as its key and a response object as its response. All right, now let's just chain a then onto the end here. We'll say return null. Doesn't really matter what we return. I'm just chaining on just to show that I'm going to the next step in my process. And the null is going to go into that variable right there. The n, we're not using it for anything. I'm just showing that this value is being sent here. So if there was something from here that I wanted to pass on, I could return my cache object, for example. And then this could be my cache object right here. Now, if I want to find out, if I've reached this point, I've opened the cache, I've created it because it was my first time through. Now, in here, if I want to know whether or not a cache exists, I can do that with caches.has. This is going to return a promise as well. And this is just a Boolean. There we go. So our next step here, line 55 was this. Line 55, the name and a Boolean, true. So asset cache 1 does exist. Simple enough. So this is how you can next up, searching for files in caches. Now there's a couple of methods that we can use here. We can use match or match all when dealing with a cache object. So we could say cache, and that's this one right here, dot match, or cache dot match all to find everything that matches, or we can say caches dot match, and this is look in all caches. So either one is going to work. These match methods are going to do the same thing, but am I looking in all or am I looking in a specific cache? So let's look in all of them. And we're going to look for one of our files here. So let's say the 111. This is the first one that we created, and we'll say ID equals 1. So that was the very first one in our cache. This one right here. We're going to look and see if that one actually exists. This returns a promise with the cache response. Now, remember how we said these are all requests and they match against responses? So when you call match, what you're getting back is a response object, which is the same thing as what you get when you do a fetch call. You get a response from the server. It's a wrapper around some file that's coming from someplace. So this response object is going to be the same thing as if I had done a fetch, and now I've done my then, and I have a response. Hey, is your response okay? Hey, do you want to call blob? Do you want to call text? Do you want to call JSON? Depending on the kind of file that came back. So we can do if statements to check these kinds of things. Hey, did you get something back from the server? Or from the cache in this case? Now, cache response. If we do not find a match, cache response is going to be null. It's not going to be an error. So that's important to remember. Now we can also check other things beyond the fact that, oh yeah, we got some sort of response. We can check the cache response to see if it got a valid status. So we can check the OK property. That'll tell us if it was 200. Or, hey, what if I'm accepting anything less than 400? So anything in the 200s or 300s is good. We can also check to see what kind of file it was. So, hey, does it have a header called content type? And, sorry, that should be has. And I want to know whether or not this was a content type that started with image. So it was image / something. I'll use my regex match. Looking for a regular expression. And inside of here, I want to know if it starts with the word image followed by a slash. That's what we're looking for. Case insensitive. So if we got something from the cache, the status that was saved in the cache was less than 400. If the response has a content type header, and if that content type header starts with image /, in that case, we do have something. So I can return cache response. So we could return from here. I'm going to search inside the cache. If I do find something, I'm going to return this cache response, which is then going to be returned, which will be returned from my then, which is going to come back up here. And if I say return from the caches, up here, what we're getting is the actual response object. So this calls this method, which calls a promise, and it's just a big chain of promises coming all the way down to here. And there we are. Now, if we didn't, we don't have a match that meets our criteria. So what do we want to do? Well, chances are we want to do a fetch. And actually, we'll throw a console log statement in here. Yeah, let's just console log the whole thing. Line 72, so it's this one right here. I'm going to comment out those console log statements here just to avoid some confusion. Sorry, these ones. There we go. Okay, so here is the response that we found in the cache. So we did get something. It is a response object, not the request. When we were looking at these, request, 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 this one is a response object. All right, so if we got to this point, we found it in the cache. So we know that we did have this thing. If we don't find it in the cache, so let's change this. The other file that was inside of here, and I'll do it even without a query string. 1016 was the other file, is not in our cache. So what do we do in situations like that? Well, dealing with the cache, dealing with the service worker, what we're going to be doing is we'll look in the cache. If we don't find it, then we're going to go to the server to find it. So how do we do that? Well, it's just a fetch. And we're going to return whatever the fetch gives us the same way we returned the cache response. So the URL string, if we didn't find it in the cache, let's go fetch it on our own. And we have a fetch response now. And I'm making these variables quite long, like cache response, fetch response, so it's easy to recognize which response object. I could call them all just RESP, response, but I prefer to be a little bit more verbose, just so it's clear about which one we're talking about. Now, if we have that, then we're going to say, you know what, if fetch response is not okay, I'm going to throw an error. And I'm going to send back the fetch response dot status text. Now, if we do have it, there's one other thing that we have to do with this response object. I can't just stick it into the cache and return it. When you have a response object, you can put it in the cache, or you can send it back to the browser. You can do one or the other. You can't do both unless you clone it. If you make a copy of it, then you've got two of them. One can go in the cache, one can go back to the browser to be used someplace else. So right here, we have a valid fetch, so I'm going to call cache.put, not add. Add was do the fetch and then put it in. I'm going to do a put, because I've done a fetch already myself. And what is it that I'm putting in there? Well, URL string, and then my response object, fetch response, I have to call the clone method. The clone method is something that exists on the response object and the request object. At any point, if you want to clone them, you can. If you've got one of those objects, you can call clone, and it'll give you another copy. Now I can call return and send it back. So this is being returned, which is being returned, which is being returned, all the way back up to where we called it up here. Or we can put another then onto the end here. So at this point, yes, we've returned it, and I'm going to call .then, and this is our response object. Now I've just got a general response, because it could be the cached one or the fetch one. Either way, I have a response object, and what do I want to do with it? Just to show that I do have one. It was not in the cache, but here is that 1016, that 1016 image. And if we come back to the cache, we will see, hey, we've actually added this other image. We looked in the cache, it wasn't there. We did a fetch, we brought it back, and we put it, a copy of it. We cloned it and put it into the cache. So this, and now the next time we run this page, we should see the same response object, but it'll be coming from the cache. There we go, found in the cache, and there it is. So now we have a cached copy. Okay, great. So we have the ability to look in the cache and get something, and if it's not there, fetch it. What else can we do with this? Well, once we have a response object, we've got all the properties that you would normally have on a response. So I'm going to, here inside of the main, I've got an output element. So I'm going to write out the name of the URL for the request, whatever file it is, and then I'm going to display the image itself. So right here, let's say document. So that is the URL itself. can test that. There it is. There's the URL. And then we can take the response, pass it along, response.json, text, blob, all these methods, return promises. So I'm going to return it and chain it on to the next. Then this is the actual blob from the response. So that this is the image itself. We need to turn that into a URL so that we can add it to our image tag that we're going to put in the page. There we go. And there it is. We've added an image to the page. Okay, last step, delete. You want to delete one of the items from the cache, or you want to delete the entire cache? We can do that. So I've already got the event listener. We had that up here at the top in our init function. We're saying if somebody clicks on the H2, call the delete cache function. Down here, this is just my function, delete cache. So I could delete a single response from the cache. Now to do the delete, because we don't have the cache object right here, so we have to open the cache again. Caches.open. And it is the app.cacheName.then gives us our cache object. Inside of here, once I have the cache, I'm going to call cache.delete. And I have to pass in, again, the string, the URL, the request object, one of those things. Let's do the middle one, the ID equals 2. That'll be the one that we remove. It'll be this one right here. There's 1, 3, 2. So item number 2 in this list. So cache.delete. We're going to look in the cache for this thing. Whatever has this name, that's the thing we're going to delete. And it gives us back a Boolean. All right, so there's number 2. And up here, if we click on this, it is gone from the cache. So there's number 3, there's number 1 for the query strings. There's the other alternative image, and we still have those other 2, but we did an exact match on this one, and we deleted it. Simple enough. I'm going to comment that out so it doesn't cause an error the next time I refresh my page. It's not going to try and delete something that doesn't exist. If you want to delete the entire cache, now it is caches.delete, and we can pass in here what is the name of the entire cache that we want to delete. It will also give us back a Boolean, so we can write that out. If you want to use that to determine whether or not you're going to do something else, save that. So cache is still here. Refresh, it's still there until we click here. Now, oh yes, it's app.cacheName. There we go. Save. Click here. True, it is gone. If we come back, cache, yep, there is nothing left in the cache. If I refresh, I'm re-adding all those things because I'm rerunning the script that opens up the cache with that name, those original adds that we did. So it does those adds, and then we looked in the cache, couldn't find the other image, did a fetch, and added it that way with the clone. All right, so that's practically everything that you ever need to know about caches. Next video, we're going to talk about integrating the service worker with the caches. So I hope this clears it up. If you have any questions about the Cache API, please feel free to leave those in the comments down below. I'll answer as many as I have time for. And as always, thanks for watching.